Good morning and welcome back, everybody. I'm recording as usual, but you're welcome, of course, to interject as you always would. Okay, so we are, if you go to the center fold of the pages, and you turn 2 pages to the right, because this is a Hebrew book going from right to left. With the third line from the top, where it says V'af al pi. So let's remind ourselves where we are, and then we'll go forward. So we are learning now chapter 4 of 12 chapters, by the way, of this work of the Tzemach Tzedek on the mitzvah of faith and belief in God, the oneness of God. And specifically now, at this point in chapter 4, we're learning version 2 of chapter 4, as I mentioned. So some of the ideas are repeated, but we're getting new language for a lot of these ideas, especially one specific idea, which we started to address already, namely as follows. We had, we'll go back to Maharal and Rambam soon, but for now, we had this idea that there's one force, we call that light, one singular force of the divine that's undefined, and then that singular force uses/animates multiple different vessels or multiple different tools, and through them engages in our world. So there's one unified force that is engaging with wisdom to project wisdom into our world. He's engaging kindness to project kindness, but this morning. But the force remains singular, the light remains singular. Right? And there, number one. Number two, more specifically, it's not the vessel per se that's doing the activity. So it isn't kindness that's bringing kindness into this world. It's God bringing kindness into the world. God himself, non-defined, that light energy, using kindness that is defined to bring kindness into this world. So on the one hand, God remains singular, but at the same time, it's he himself who is truly projecting things into creation. This is what we were speaking about on this analogy of the light in the vessel. Yeah? Oh, here we go. Yeah? Okay. Remember all this? Does someone come back to us? Okay. From there we went to, so now where did these vessels come from? Where did the vessels come from? Okay, so you explained how the light, the energy is singular, one, transcendent, non-defined, but it's using these tools by which it itself projects kindness, etc., etc. But the tools themselves, in other words, kindness itself, where did it come from? What is it? So we started to explain that too is godly. Not God, but it's godly, because God condenses himself into these tools that he then projects his non-defined light through to invest in our world. So the vessels themselves are not God, they're defined, but they're godly. This is what we left off with. And we had to try to, and version 2 is going to give us more language to understand what that means, that you have these defined things that are godly. Okay. Now, and what this means, that God condenses himself into definition, but at the same time, he remains non-defined, right? Because till now we're saying that the light is non-defined. The definition only comes from the tools. But now we're saying the tools themselves are godly, which means God himself has to find himself in these tools, in these definitions. Clear? This is where we are.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Could you say, God is God. God chooses to express something in the form of what he chooses to create as a kindness, and will define it by a vessel, and then is able to express a limited, because there's a definition, now there's limits to it, and this is, so he chooses to create kindness and then express himself through it, but it's him who created in the first place, so it all...
Yeah, so obviously that's true, but we're going to give more language to understand that, and here's where the conundrum is, because you're right. Let's just start with that. You're right. But we have to explain this. And let's understand the problem that we have to explain. Mm-hmm. So what you said is he created kindness. Then it's a creation. It's not him.
Right.
He created this cup also. Yeah. But this cup isn't him. Yeah. And I'm not going to call the cup godly either. No. But that vessel I am calling godly. Uh-huh. So where's that difference? How does that work? Where on the one hand, it's not him himself. It's something he, quote, unquote, created. And at the same time, it is godly. It's not separate from him in the same way, let's say this cup is separate from him in theory.
But I mean,
right, so we have to understand what that means.
But emotion is not the same as physical objects.
God's not a being that has emotions, right?
No.
So there's the point. So you don't create your emotions. You're trapped in them. God created those emotions.
God created those.
Right? So he created something, but then that thing becomes him. Or becomes godly. It's, right? You're not wrong. I'm just explaining the problem that we have to solve. Let's take more language to understand this. Because whereas you are trapped in your emotions, there's you, that's it, finished. And we're going to identify that. That's literally going to be our topic right now. But God is not these things that define him. But yet they are godly. So it's not exactly the same as any analogy we could possibly give. So you're not wrong, but we have to give language. Just understand.
He created us. And because he created us and gave us these attributes, so we're all defined, we are one, like a one vessel kind of thing. Whereas if he's as the creator of this vessel, he is not limited to the limit that he gave to us.
You're saying a lot of words, but we have to understand what that means. Okay, I don't want to
I'm
belabor the point.
Understand it. That's why I'm not.
Which is where we're going to go, right?
Okay.
That's why we're here, to understand this.
Yeah.
But let's first understand the problem. Let's understand the problem we have to solve. The problem we need to solve is, again, that none of these definitions predate God's existence, obviously, right? Our definitions predate us. Kindness predates my existence. So does intelligence, so does things. So now I come into being and I have all these things that already exist before me. So they define me. That's not true for God. None of these things predate God. So it's easy to say, like Maharal said, that these are all just created beings that he uses as tools, right? But Chassidus did not want to settle for that. Because what that means is that these things, kindness, intelligence, that he projects into creation are not really him. Because they're created things. As opposed to me, my intelligence is me. It's not a created thing that I made up. It's something that's part of my definition. For God, they're not. So now that means we're putting God at a distance from us. That was the quote unquote problem with Maharal, is that God is non-defined beyond us. And whatever he's projecting into creation is not really him. Right? And we want, as it were, God to be invested into creation, which means God has to be within the definition. But at the same time, these definitions don't define him. So he's in the definitions, they don't define him. This is the problem we have to solve. Right? And again, like I mentioned a bunch of times, even after we solve them, the mystery of the problem is going to remain a mystery. Because it's inherently unsolvable. It's a square in a circle. Right? So one is either defined by them or is not. Okay. So they're created, and at the same time, they're godly. This is what we're talking about right now. God made these vessels, but these vessels are godly, even though they are not God, not himself. Because their definition, they can't be God. But they're godly.
They're godly because they were created by him?
Well, this is also, the cup was also created by God, but it's not godly. This cup is certainly not godly. But those vessels are godly, somehow. Even though they're also created.
But
Right, they're brought into being by him.
God is not expressing himself through this cup.
What does that mean that God... Okay, we're using words.
I understand, but
You're not wrong. Right? You have to understand it. Let's understand it, right?
What would you say?
Throwing out the answer is to defeat the purpose of what we're learning, right? So let's understand what we're saying. Yeah.
This might be completely off, but like, what would you consider a human Jew, like a Jew, or like are we God?
It is off, so I don't want to go there because we're now learning about the nature of God himself. Let's understand what that is. Like, we can't all turn in 1 second. But let's work through it. We have to think about it and understand it, deal with it, be mystified by it. You know, we're not going to get a neat little package put in your pocket and walk home. Right. Not happening. And if that happens, it means you didn't understand anything. So let's accept that we're going to have to be mystified and try to work through that mystery. Okay. So the last thing left off with was a analogy to describe how something can be condensed, and that condensed factor doesn't define the thing, but it still is the thing. This is what we're trying to do. The vessels are defined, they're condensed. It doesn't define God, but God's in them. And therefore they are godly. That's what we're trying to solve. So the analogy we gave was of a teacher of a very lofty caliber who teaches a simple child. So he doesn't use this example, but let's say we're using this example of a advanced teacher of mathematics who's now teaching his 2-year-old or 3-year-old 1 + 1 = 2. And taking an apple and another apple and showing them 1 + 1 = 2. Now, the intelligence that is being transmitted from the teacher, from the parent, to the child is indeed the intelligence of the teacher. But at the same time, it's not all the intelligence of the teacher. So the teacher has to condense his brain, stop thinking or put in the back burner all the thoughts he has about advanced mathematics, extract a tiny little element of his intelligence, 1 + 1 = 2, and then even that has to be condensed into such a language that the kid can understand, taking out 2 apples and putting it together. Right? But the information that's being transmitted is not other from the teacher. In other words, when the teacher is speaking to the child and teaching him 1 + 1 = 2, and then goes to university and teaches advanced mathematics, it's not, oh, this is his intelligence in the mathematics, in the classroom, but when he talks to this child, it's not his intelligence. They're both his intelligence. Just one's an extremely condensed version. Right? This was the analogy we gave, where something could be condensed into something completely insignificant from its original form, and yet it's still that very thing that's there in that condensed version. That's where we left off. So God himself is infinite, and yet he condenses himself into wisdom, intelligence, and kindness, wisdom, and so on and so forth. Kindness, strength, and so on. And yet all those condensed things don't define him, but it's truly him. In the same way, it's truly the teacher saying 1 + 1 = 2, even though it's an extremely condensed version of the teacher's intelligence. That's where we left off. So now what we're going to get to is where the analogy fails us. Even though the analogy is working for us, we have to understand the limitations of the analogy and why it fails us, and this gets to what we were speaking about just a few minutes ago. Okay, so let's read. Third line from the top of the page on the right side. So if you're a centerfold, turn 2 to the right, and third line. Even though the analogy does not match the analog. The analogy being the teacher talking to this 2-year-old, who's condensing his knowledge to match the 2-year-old. It's truly him speaking, it's truly his intelligence, but it's a condensed version. And the analog is God is infinite, condensing himself into wisdom, kindness, and so on. Now, why does the analogy fail us? Because the intellect of the teacher, the parent, that is the very character of the teacher and the parent. The one who's speaking is defined by intelligence. Here it's intelligence on a scale of 1,000, and here it's in a scale of intelligence on a scale of 1. If we gave it a number, 1,000 being the advanced mathematics in the classroom, and 1 being 1 + 1 = 2, talking to a 2-year-old. So we stayed in the realm of intelligence, we just condensed it. Right? That's easier to imagine than Masha'enke. By contrast, when we talk about God, the analog, Hadas, the whole notion of intelligence or knowledge, the very notion of intelligence is infinitely distant from the essence of God himself. So the leap is much greater. And it's not just greater because here we went from 1,000 to 1, and for God we're going from 1,000,000 to 1. It's because it's infinite. So the analogy completely fails us. And this gets to the point we were saying before. The teacher, before you even start talking, is an intelligent being. Okay, so now he's talking to adults. He's got to condense his words into adult language. Now he's talking to a 2-year-old. He's got to condense his intelligence to a 2-year-old, pare it down, and maybe even ignore most of his intelligence because 1 + 1 = 2 barely contains the surface of what he actually knows in mathematics. Right? So, but he hasn't left the realm of who he is. He just really condensed it. Whereas with God, when you're talking about infinite and then going to definition, he left the realm of what he truly is to become this definition. So the analogy totally fails us. Because that this definition of intelligence wasn't the thing before. Whereas in the case of the teacher, the intelligence of 1 + 1 = 2 existed in the teacher's brain before he spoke to his child about it. It was just insignificant compared to all the rest of the knowledge. But all this already existed. And it defined him.
But Hashem is not that way.
And Hashem's not that way. Intelligence didn't exist. It never defined him. And now he's creating definition. So there's an infinite gap between the analogy and the analog. Clear? Okay.
Could you?
Yeah.
I don't even know if that would work though. But like the numbers themselves are infinite. So to say that 1 and 2 defines numbers, like all of the numbers, I mean, not even. Still, no.
It doesn't,
No.
right?
No.
I don't want to go down the road too
No.
far, but numbers being infinite is not that they're really
No, I
infinite.
know.
It's that they haven't
Okay.
met their limit yet. It's not really infinite in essence. Whatever, I don't want to go down there. In other words, you never have infinite numbers in your hand or in your mind, ever. It's just that when you're counting, you can always keep on going. Right? Which means you don't really have infinite at all. You just haven't, you just won't reach the end of finite. Right? God's infinitude is not because he's never going to stop.
No.
It's because it's inherently
Yes.
non-stopping.
Yeah.
Whereas numbers is not inherently non-stopping. It's just still expanding. It hasn't stopped expanding yet, type of thing. Whatever. I want to leave that alone. But my point is, we have no real ratio for infinite in our world.
Right.
True infinite. It doesn't exist. Anyway, the best we have is finite that hasn't stopped yet. It's the best we have. Like time. It didn't stop yet. So it's infinite. We're at infinite time now? No, we're not. Or the universe is infinitely expanding. So the universe is an infinite distance? No, it just hasn't stopped expanding yet. And we know it won't, or we assume it won't stop expanding. It's not infinite yet, because infinite doesn't exist in our realm at all.
I don't know. For everything else, I agree except for numbers. I don't know why. Why can't you always add one more? There's no.
You can always add one more. Exactly my
no
point.
such-
But you never actually hit infinite. When do you hit infinite numbers? You don't, and you can't, and you never
The
will.
definition of infinite is with that definition. That's what it is.
So the definition of infinite for us is that we haven't reached the end of finite yet. That's my point. Whereas for God, his infinite is not because he hasn't reached the end of finite, because it is infinite, period. Right? And that version of infinite does not exist in our world, period. That's my point. So there's an infinite gap between whatever we describe here and God's truth. Right? So getting back to the point here, in the analogy, there is a vast difference, however you want to quantify it, between the 1 + 1 = 2 and the mathematics that he truly thinks. But that vast distinct separation is measurable. Because to begin with, he was an intelligent being. To begin with, all that information was there, and he pared it down. By 100,000 degrees, by 1,000,000 degrees, it's still a number. There's still a finitude between his advanced intelligence and what he's speaking to the child. Whereas with God, there is no line to be drawn between intelligence and him himself. There isn't that. Okay, so let's see inside. Ki seichel harav, so 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. Ki seichel harav, because the intelligence of the teacher, hu mohoseh mamish, that is his very being. He's defined by being an intelligent person. And therefore, when he pares it down, okay, so he's pared down the intelligence that already existed to a simplified version of intelligence. Mashenkin adas, but the idea of intelligence, mohoseh, its very being, rachaik, is distant, mimohoseh kadosh baruch hu, from the very beingness of God himself. Hapashi patachlis, which is absolutely simple and transcendent and non-defined. And ein zeh el richuk yoser. But nonetheless, says Tzemach Tzedek, nonetheless, in that regard, the analogy fails. But it doesn't fail in the fact that it demonstrates the capacity for something to be condensed, not be defined by it, but still be there. It's just that for God, the paring down is at infinite distance. But the notion of the paring down still remains an analogy. In that the teacher is found in the simple ideas that don't define him, it's still him there, whilst he's condensed. So too is true that God is still there in this condensed form, intelligence, wisdom, kindness, and so on, even though the distance between him and the place he's being condensed to is infinitely farther than the distance between the intelligence of the teacher and what he's teaching. Hello?
I do, but I actually do think it's different.
There's never going to be an analogy that's going to match. Because we don't have infinite, period. But it just helps us understand that something can be condensed somewhere and it still be that person, it still be that thing. In other words, just because it's condensed doesn't mean it's not it, is the point. So even though the condensing that God has to do is much grander, not just grander because it's greater number, but grander infinitely, it doesn't change the fact that in his condensing himself into these definitions, it's still him. And in that regard, the analogy works for us. That's the only regard in which the analogy will work for us. Any other way, it won't work.
The fact that there is zero connection between what he created and himself, like that.
That infinite distance.
There is a connection. But
Correct.
That fact that there is no
Throws
connection
a wrench into it.
implies, which is not, but it implies that it's disconnected from
Correct.
him because there is no connection. There is an obvious zero there.
Now you're pointing to the problem we're trying to solve. It's correct. It's exactly what I was trying to get to earlier, that this is an inherent problem that we have to solve. And we're going to work through it. But let's just understand at this point that we're accepting from this analogy that condensing yourself doesn't mean we lost you.
We're gonna have to accept that because
We have to accept that because there's an infinite gap, which we're going to have to deal. Yes, correct. So it should seem
What's the gap?
the gap is that this is infinite, non-defined, and here's the definition.
between God
And definition.
kindness, there is
Right?
no connection. There's
Is
zero.
it like metaphorically a space or?
It's conceptually infinitely detached from each other. We can't use space as a measure, or even number as a measure. We use number because we don't have anything else, but we can't. Which is to the point here that it's
Saying that
infinitely
there
distant.
isn't a space between us, or there is. I don't know.
So, yes. Well, yes and no, right? That's the point. In other words, it's not as if. Okay, let's put it this way. Let's make your point stronger. We say God's transcendent. So if I took a rocket ship and I flew far up and I busted through the atmosphere, I'm going to hit transcendence? Obviously not. So where's the transcendence? Geographically. It's less right here on this table than it is outside the universe. it's equally the same, and it's equally the same distant. Right? In the same way I have no access to the transcendence while I sit here at the table, I also will have no access to transcendence even if I bust it through the atmosphere with using a rocket ship or something. It's laughable, right? So the transcendence is not a question of geography. It's a question of inherent beingness. My inherent being does not allow me to access transcendence, period, because I'm not transcendent. Right? And that's why we call it transcendent, not because it's far away, but because it's infinitely far away, considering it's right here. This is going to be the solution to the problem, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, so but yes, this is all in the right direction. Okay, so let's read then. Because this is all right, but we have to work through all of it. We have to really work through it. Okay. So Shetzimtzim Oiroi, God condensed his light, which is non-defined, to be contained in an entity that's far from him, infinitely distant from him. But it's still him that's being condensed in there. But nonetheless, it's still not separate from him. Even though it's of a different entity, because he's infinite, non-defined, and this is defined, but it's still him in those definition. Again, we're saying the words we're accepting, let's get language. That's the problem. That's correct. Very good. Elokus, and this is the idea of godly. In Yiddish, getlich b'yid, lashon Yiddish. As opposed to God, I mentioned this before, that the Kabbalists, and especially Chassidus, introduces this notion of godly. Right? Because when you have the notion of God and creation, you already have there an infinite distance between God and creation. Whether you define it like Maharal, where God's not defined, or whether you define it like Rambam, where God is one with his intelligence, there's still God, creation is an infinite gap. But Chassidus introduces this notion of godly, definitions that exist in our realm, intelligence, kindness, etc., but they are godly definitions. The conundrum we're trying to solve. But this is what we're introducing now, that there's a notion of godly, that's God himself condensed in these definitions, notwithstanding the fact that he's beyond the definitions. Again, this is where we have to circle, which we're going to get to. We're going to add more words. Kolemamim to say, hispashtus koiches elakim. That is, these are, hispashtus means like the expansion of divine power, divine capacity. V'lo atzmus imamish, but not his very essence. Because his very essence is non-defined. But the expansion of this essential power can end up in definition. Even though his essence remains non-defined, as it expands and expresses itself, it can condense itself into definition. Okay, let's go forward. For example, now we're going to get another example. The same way we would refer to thought and speech as powers of the soul. Shehem, which they are, or let's just say the conscious instead of the soul. We'll use the word conscious. Shehem ispashtus oyer nefesh. They are an expression of the light or the energy of the conscious. V'le'atz musa, not the essence of my consciousness. My essential consciousness is not my thoughts, certainly not my speech, but not even my thoughts. It's in my thoughts that I consider my consciousness, but my consciousness is not my thoughts. Right? So I express myself in my thoughts and my speech, but it's not me. But the cause, nonetheless, top of the next page, Eino nefradim, my thought and speech are not separate from me. So here again, another analogy. Here, it's not an analogy of condensing, which was the analogy we used by the teacher. Here, it's an analogy to demonstrate that something can be an extension of me, but not be me. So who is talking? It's Levi Nu talking. But talking is not Levi Nu. It's Levi Nu thinking. But thinking is not Levi Nu. So it's me there, because it's an expression of me, but it isn't me. But it's still me in there, even though I am far beyond talking and thinking. Because I am I. I am my own self. Even my awareness of myself is not me. I'm aware of myself. You know, it's just funny. I was listening to someone walking down the hallway, and someone said, my brain is telling me. And it just hit me. Who's the me that your brain is talking to? But we all use that language because we all internally feel that way. There's me that my mind is talking to, right? So, your mind is not you. It's some other thing that's talking to you. No, it is me. But it's me expressing myself to me. Great. But it's not you. And here we have another analogy to describe how God's essence is beyond definition, like my consciousness that's, at least relatively speaking, beyond definition, expressed in very defined terms, thoughts and speech. And those thoughts and speech are not me, but not detached from me. They fully express me, even though it's not me in totality. Another analogy. Now he continues. Therefore, you're talking, here we're kind of repeating some of the stuff we learned before, but in this new language. It's possible. Therefore, it's possible. And therefore, it's correct to say, the knowledge by which God himself, knows creation, that is the life that sustains that created being. The fact that God knows the table exists is why it exists. It can't exist without his knowing of its existence. Right? Right? So now who created the table? Knowledge created the table? God created the table. God created the table through knowledge. In the same way, my speech is me, but not me. Right? So the creative force that God's invested in creation, his knowledge of it, is him, but not defining him. Right? As he explains, because this knowledge that God knows creation, notwithstanding the fact, if we're going to compare God's knowledge of creation to his very essence, it's completely distant, just as far as created beings are far to himself. That's the point we were talking about earlier. God's distance from his knowledge of creation is just as far as his distance from creation. Because created beings are defined, his knowledge of creation is defined. So he's equally distant from them in his very essence. What this is, when we say he's distant from both the knowledge of creation and he's distant equally to creation itself, that's only so far as the distance of the essential being of knowledge and his being, defined, not defined, and that's the same thing as created being defined, him not defined.
So why do we need the knowledge?
Nonetheless, but nonetheless, that knowledge that he has of creation is still an extension from him, even though as far as that entity goes, it's completely distant from his essence. In the same way, the entity of speech is completely distant from my essence, and yet it's still me speaking. God's knowledge of creation is completely distant from his essence, because in his essence he's beyond the whole notion of knowledge, but it's still him doing the knowledge.
So why do we need these vessels? Why do we need this knowledge? Why can't he just do creation without it?
Well, we are going to get there, because he's going to ask that question later.
Okay.
And the short answer is because, we'll get there. That's a good question. It's a very good question, because in theory, it doesn't do anything. Right? Okay, good question. Let's go there.
I should say that, and we have a spark of godliness in each of us. Is that the reason why we have that feeling of...
She asked that earlier. I want to put a pin in that, because it's going to take us around along a different way. Because now we have to talk about just God's oneness here, because otherwise we're going to get... because very subtle ideas, and we want to keep, like we say in Yiddish, halt cup. We want to hold our heads. Again, using that language. I'm going to hold my head. All right. Right? Okay, nonetheless, this knowledge that God has of creation, Elokus, is an expression of his godliness, even though in its very essence, knowledge is completely distant from his very essence, which is beyond definition. To the point that it's nonetheless an expression of him, to the point that that this knowledge of creation has the capacity to bring into being all that exists from nothing, as we will explain further. Okay, so you put a lot of words down, now try to understand them. And to understand this, he's going to take us way back to one of the original questions we had way at the beginning. And he's going to almost redraw the board, but now redraw the board with all this information we have. Having discussed Rambam's view, having discussed Maharal's view, having discussed the Hasidic synthesis between the two, now he's going to go back to the original question, which is, how do you get plurality from singularity? And redraw the board based on all the information we have. And this is really where we're going to get the language that we've been looking for the whole time. Okay, you clear where we're going? Mm-hmm. So let's see. Middle of the left-hand side. To understand this concept truly, in its full depth, Yuvan will understand it based on what we need to answer. The true answer. So there is one answer, but then there's a true answer. We need to get to the true answer. With regard to his stifus ribanim his stifus means the outcome. How do they translate them? Come from. Stifus means like the outpouring of ribuy, of multiplicity, of things that exist, from absolute true oneness. We have to get back to getting to the true answer to that question. What's the real answer to the question of how does pure singularity produce multiplicity? Because in truth, L'chora kasha. There's a very simple surface level question. Ki min ha'echad ha'pashut, because from absolute oneness that's non-defined, seemingly it's inappropriate for anything to be rak echad but oneness. Oneness in its absolute sense should only produce oneness in its absolute sense, seemingly. That's the basic question. We're going to get to soon a deeper layer of question and a deeper layer of answer. But on the surface level, that's the question. Oneness should produce oneness. That's it. I am a complex creature. I have intelligence, I have emotions, I have all kinds of capacities. So when I act in the world, I act out all the complexity that I have, resulting in multiple different things that it produced. That's because I start out as a complex being. But if you start out as an absolute singularity, then with what complexity are you producing complexity? You don't have complexity. You're just singular. So whatever's produced should just remain singular. That's all. You just express what you are. So if you have complexity, produce complexity. If you have oneness, you produce oneness. Right? And that's what he explains. If so, Kushazu, this question will be, the same question will apply to God's knowledge of multiple creations from a singularity. Now, let's go back to what we know already about Maharal, who also addressed this question. And that which the great genius, the Maharal, mentioned before, Maharal said, in the same way my hand can do lots of different things, right? It can pick up a cup, it can paint, it can write, it can bang on the table. It's not going to change the singularity of my hand, right? That's what Maharal said. So too, God's a singular, and he produces a bunch of different actions. But the actions don't define his singularity, right? That was Maharal said, creating this distance between him and the actions he's doing, because he remains absolutely one, and the fact that he's doing a bunch of things, yay, my hand does a lot of things also. It doesn't change the fact that I have one hand. That was Maharal's problem. But Maharal's solution, right? But Tzemach Tzedek is going to challenge that too. Last line on the left-hand side, but that premise itself raises the question. Seemingly. How's that? Why is it that the singular thing, or how is it that the singular thing is doing a bunch of different actions? Right? In other words, well, why does our perspective exist? Is the question. Our perspective is part of the multiplicity. Why should it exist? Or how does it exist? In other words, this is it's a Tzedek's question. My hand produces a lot of actions because my hand is a moving object. Great. So do lots of movement. God's not a moving object that has to create anything. So how does the singularity produce multiplicity? The question is going to become deeper soon. But this is the premise of the question. So you, Maharal, want to make a different, you want to separate between the multiplicity and him by saying he's a singular, and the same singulars can do lots of things. It doesn't change the singularity. Great, but why would any of those things produce from, how and why would any of these things even be produced from the singularity?
But a hand has fingers. It has...
Exactly.
It's not...
Exactly the point. So the hand, which does lots of things, very nice, but the hand starts off with a certain set of tools, and it's expressing them. God's not starting off with a set of tools that he's expressing. It's singularity. So why would there be any multiplicity at all? So we have to get to the real answer then. Right? So beyond the Maharal's answer, we got to go deeper. Right? So the true answer is that which the Meshader means the one who sings, the psalmist. And Tillim writes, quote from Tillim, Marab masach Hashem, how many are your deeds? Kulam b'chachma sisa, you made all of them with wisdom. That's the reading. That's the translation. The simple reading is, we're complimenting God. Wow, look how many things you did. Everything you did, you made with wisdom. Okay? But the Tzemach Tzedek turns it into a question. Marab masach Hashem, how many actions are you doing, God? Why is there multiplicity? Not like wonder, wow, look how many you've done. But literally, what? Marab masach Hashem. What is this multiplicity that you've done? Question mark. Kalemar, meaning to say, it's truly curious. Why is how is there so many different things you've done? Question mark. As opposed to wonderment and compliment, he's taking it quite literally. Question mark. What is the deal with all this multiplicity? How is there multiplicity from absolute singularity and oneness? And therefore the verse continues and says, you made all of them with chachma. And that's how you have multiplicity. So the verse is giving the question and the answer. How do you have so many? Answer, because you made all of them with wisdom. So somehow wisdom, chachma, is this capacity that allows singularity to transform into multiplicity. How do we do that? Meaning to say, if all these activities, all these different multiple things that God does, were to be drawn from, that God would express himself as he is, your question would remain. Because if you express yourself as you are, all you have is oneness. There's no other way to express yourself, seemingly. We'll get to further how God could do more than that. But for now, oneness should only express oneness. So if all you did was express you as you are, all you'd have is oneness. But you didn't express yourself as you are. Truthfully, what you did was you expressed yourself through wisdom. So you didn't express yourself as you are. You stuck yourself into something called chachma, and then you expressed yourself. Now we have multiplicity. Because you yourself would never land in multiplicity. At least this is where we are now. We're going to get to deeper layers. But this is where we are now, yeah?
So a single entity became two.
So that's where we have to go back to the analogy that his condensing doesn't lose himself. Right? So we didn't let go of the analogy, but now that we have the analogy, we're getting deeper understanding of what this means that God condenses himself. So, as we'll see.
Complete unity is just one. One cannot be divided by any other number. One is one. The moment one becomes something else, it's no longer one. So
yeah. So we have to solve that. Yes. Very good. So let's see. Why does Chachma solve the problem? At least for now, because we're going to get to a deeper layer. Good question too. Right. That's our problem. Yeah. Very good. Where does Chachma come from? Okay. So let's see. This is all going to come clear, but we're working through it again. But truthfully, you created it through Chachma. He created all this multiplicity through the means of this thing called Chachma. Because God enclosed himself, he condensed himself into this element, Hanikras Chachma, it's called Chachma, and in it, and through it, he then influences and invests into creation, which is multiple. And Chachma itself can produce multiplicity, because as we mentioned above, God is not defined by intelligence. So because intelligence isn't the definition of God, intelligence can produce multiplicity, and it's only by God condensing himself into intelligence that there can be multiplicity. Okay? If so, considering that God expresses himself through the medium of Chachma, we won't be left with the question that even though he remains absolutely singular and one, he can influence and create and project multiplicity. Because he invests through his great capacity into this vessel called Chachma, and from Chachma it projects forward. The Seder. Yeah.
Every projection is no longer, that's like everything you're saying, everything is out of that one.
We're going level by level. So we started off with Maral by saying God's distant from the investment. Okay, but why should that happen? So now we're saying this medium called Chachma. Okay, we get to the next level, how we got there. But we're progressing forward. And why is it that Chachma allows that, and why it couldn't be avoided? As we'll see. Which gets to your question, why do you need intelligence to begin with? All very similar question. We're dancing around the right question. Yeah. So V'seder Eschalkus Hainu, which is why I'm moving a little bit quickly here, because where's the time? Maybe next week we'll have to get to the next level, but at least we'll finish this part. Okay. V'seder Eschalkus Hainu, and the sequence of how these things get divided up. B'chinas Yud Sfiras, begin with the 10 Sfiras. Shenetzlu min HaChachma, which is Netzel means like emanated. It flows forward from this first level called Chachma, Shenekras Sveishis, which is called the beginning. In other words, what he's adding here is, that we haven't known yet is and this is a bit different than the Maharal. And this is going to become a key going forward. The Maharal said there's one singular light with multiple different vessels, and the vessels don't define him. He's the undefined light. So God's projection into Chesed, into kindness, begins in Chesed. The light goes into all these vessels, and whichever vessel it's in, that's how it produces on the other end. Okay, now the Tzemach is telling us, actually, it doesn't go directly to Chesed, because that singularity would be ending up in multiplicity, Chachma, Bina, Tiferet, and so on. What's happening is it's only going to Chachma, and it's through Chachma that it produces Chesed, Kavod, Tiferet, and so on. So it's a little bit of a subtle change here, in that the undefined energy is not manifesting multiplicity. It's condensing himself into a singularity that has the capacity to produce multiplicity. That's Chachma. There's a subtle nuance change here, that the condensing is not into multiplicity, as we thought till now. It's actually condensing into something that has the capacity to produce multiplicity. That's Chachma. So it puts Chachma in a unique position. We still have to address, well, where did Chachma come from and why is it there? But now at least we're getting closer to this notion that it's not that the multiplicity is still him invested in it, but not him trapped in the multiplicity. Because he's condensed in this thing called Chachma that produces the multiplicity. Okay, so let's see. So, where am I? So, the 10 spheres are produced from Chachma, it's called the beginning. And then through these 10 spheres, he then invests into creation. And that's why there's division in creation. There's multiplicity in creation. Because of the vessel that was giving it its flow. But that vessel itself only was produced because of Chachma. Right, so it's two-step. It's God's light condensed into Chachma that then produces the 10 spheres that then produce multiplicity of our creation. And he gives us some examples. Like the influence that God will project into creation through kindness will match kindness. Ve'hem, namely, or physical light in the world is a creation of chesed. Mayim, water, which parallel chesed because they flow outward, like chesed flows outward. Kindness, generosity flows outward. Which is created on day one, in which day one is a manifestation of divine chesed, generosity. And then conversely, any investment that God does through the capacity of gvura, which is strength, will mirror strength, and that is the sky which separates, etc. Okay. And the same thing is true of all the various different attributes, as we'll explain later. He's going to give us a few more lines in this before we get to the deeper level. I know everybody's waiting to get there. What time do we have to stop? Because I have an analogy coming up very shortly.
What time is it now?
23?
Few more minutes.
Few more minutes? Okay.
10:30.
So we'll go to 10:30. So I'll try to move through this quickly because I want to get to the analogy he's about to give us. And the multiple creations are because the various different attributes interact with each other, producing multiplicity. And the general principle is the influence into creation changes based on which vessel is being used. Even though the power remains one, as we have been learning all the way until now, which is the oneness, singular, ultimate, non-defined singularity. Okay, now let's get to an analogy, a new analogy we haven't used yet. The analogy for this is, Yodua is well known, it's brought in a book called Pardes chapter 2, which the analogy is, Ke'in hashemesh va'esh. The analogy is the way in which the sun and fire works. Fire, let's just use fire. Fire only has one power. And that is heat. That's all fire does. But with that very power, it'll melt wax, and make liquids congeal and freeze. So opposite effects. Here it's making something. No, sorry, it'll melt wax and it won't make liquid freeze, but it'll make certain liquids congeal. Right? I think
And boil an egg.
an egg congeals. There you go. That's an example. Thank you. I'm trying to think of something cooking where you get congealed food. Yes. It'll melt that which is. Congeal that which is liquid. Usavash it'll cook. Visisrif it'll burn. Visash it'll make certain things black. Visalba make other things white. It's not because it has the capacity to make things white to cook. It just has heat. But depending on what that heat's interacting with, it'll result in a different action, even though its power remains singular. So here's a new example, which is not unsimilar to the previous ones, which still fall short as we've already know. Right? And the various different effects, halas that we just described, is because of the different recipients of that power. Without that resulting in us obligating that the fire itself has multiple powers. Okay, this ends our analogy, right? But we're not done yet, obviously. Because what's going to be our next question? What's going to be our next question? Did we solve the problem already? What was our problem? What was our original problem? How does multiplicity land in, how does singularity multiplicity? Right, so our answer was, we created a singular power, chachma, analogy, heat, and that singular power produces multiple different actions depending on what it's interacting with. Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, and so on. Right? And where's our real problem?
Where did he come from?
First of all, where did he come from? So we have to describe him condensing himself into that thing, right? But then there's going to be an even bigger problem, which is, why is it that singularity has to produce singularity? Why is that the case? The premise is that everything produces that which it contains inside of itself. That's the premise. So because God only contains oneness, therefore he produces oneness. So you're telling me now that oneness is a definition that contains God? The whole notion that you can only produce that which you have is because the things that you have are outside of you and contain you. Right? So intelligence exists before I was born. Kindness exists before I was born. All the things I have exist before I was born, and they come together to make me, and therefore I'm defined by them. Right? So oneness predates God that defines God? That's not true.
God is not definable.
Non-definable. So then why can't he produce that which is multiple? So where's your question really?
But if Hashem is
So now we're throwing a wrench into the whole thing. You follow the question we just asked? The premise that we have to square the circle because you're non-definable and how do you produce definition, that's only based on our thinking that everything's limited to producing that which itself is. That's only true if those things you have contain you. But God is not contained by the definitions that he himself has, even the definitions of oneness. So why do we even have a question? Why can't multiplicity come from oneness? Let it come from oneness. Who cares?
like a mother or a father, they have what's inside them, but they can't do it on their own.
I'm sorry, say it again?
Like a mother has her eggs and the father has the seeds for the plant, whatever.
Right.
They can't do it on their own,
Right.
even if it's inside them.
Correct. Oh, yes, good point.
So
right.
they need a something to produce.
Again, so, right. Which means, okay, you're taking me a step further. Because these definitions define me, when I produce them, I require something outside of me in which they're going to be produced.
Yeah.
None of that applies to God. So the whole question of why he can or can't produce something, considering his oneness, is a non-starter.
We only can work with words and definitions. So you can't define something that's undefinable. So we're trying to use words to define. So our
Yeah, very good. Okay, very good.
word that we could possibly use is oneness in its complete form, and oneness in its true concept, because nothing ever really is one. I mean, Adam, we can already split. For us, the concept of oneness is already beyond definition.
Correct. Yeah.
So we're using a beyond definition to define something which is beyond, and so that's what we have. We have to start somewhere.
Very good. And therefore, our question is not, how did you, God, do this? Or how could it be that you did it? The question really is, considering what we know about our reality, we have to reverse engineer, what did you do? You could have done otherwise. Obviously, you could have done otherwise. It's irrelevant. You could have done it however you wanted. And that's to your point about who said we need this. The question is only in the reverse. We see what there is. So now it's reverse engineer. How'd you get here? That you couldn't have done it another way? Of course you could do it another way. So the question is not, how could singularity produce multiplicity? The question is, considering that we see multiplicity, how do we get it from your oneness? Not because you can't do it otherwise. That's not the real question. So now it changes the entire conversation. So now everything we're talking about till now, all these analogies about God, is not because those things are the only way it works for God. It's because these things explain for us how we got to where we are. Not because you have to do them this way. Right? It's not like your oneness precludes you from making multiplicity. Wait, what? my multiplicity precludes us from doing things that I don't have. Great. That's because I'm defied by the multiple things that make me. So I'm trapped by these things because these things predate me. God's not trapped by any of these definitions, even the oneness. So our question, how does oneness produce multiplicity? It's not a real question. The question is, considering we see multiplicity, how do we get here from your oneness? That's a better question. And to that, we have the answer, Chachma. And to that, we have the answer, light, vessels, and so on and so forth. So all the answers are reverse engineering, rather they are explaining you.
They're explaining the decisions
Right.
that...
So now that we have all this language, now we can ask this question and do it. If we started out with this question, we wouldn't even understand what we were asking. We would not if you start off by asking, why are we defining creation from you and you have no definition, we don't know what we're talking about. So we started from talking about the theory of God, and now that we have all the theories on the table, we ask the most basic question, which is like, thank you for your theories, they don't apply at all. So why give me theories? Oh, why am I giving you theories? Well, because we see reality. So let's reverse engineer how these realities came. Okay, now we have to apply theories. But this question would only work after the last 3 chapters. We would not understand it if the whole book opened up with this question. Right? So everything was leading, right? Because you kept on saying, God can do whatever he wants. Of course that's true, he can do whatever he wants. And that's what we have to get to. We first have to understand what are the pieces on the table, what are the problems we're trying to solve. Right? And then once we understand the problems we're trying to solve, then we can go to, okay, you know something? None of these problems are actually problems for you. They're only problems because we see our reality and we have to explain it to ourselves. Great, so let's reverse engineer and see how you did that. That's coming, God willing.
Okay.
So it's a big setup to get to this in some way. Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Okay, so God willing next week, I'm hoping we can finish a chapter next week. It seems like we could. I think we should be able to. Because once we understand this premise, which I already just said, but we're going to see the Tzemach words, everything else is going to flow much easier because we already have all the theory. We just have to reapply it now, coming from this angle rather from the angle of we're figuring you out, God, to switching to, okay, we're figuring out how we came from you, God, rather than how you are God. And once we change that, we can take all the theory we already have and just reapply it. And then once we have that, then we can truly understand what it means godly. Right? Because we see in reality, you're invested in things. Okay, so you could have done any way you wanted. But the fact is, we see you're invested in particular things. So, okay, we have godly. And now we have a relationship with you. Which is where we're going.
Okay.
Follow?
Up until the last 3 seconds, yes. Because of this
Okay.
godly part is creating for me issues because the distance between
Okay, we'll get-
Chachma
yes.
and God
Because
is
we-
so vast. Like, how does it?
It doesn't. The point is because it's not defined by any. Okay, we'll get there.
Yeah, there
this
is
is next
no
week.
definition. That's
This
the
is next
problem,
week, God
like,
willing.
yeah.
Yes, this is next week. But now we're not coming from the question of how you did this. We're coming from a question of how did we land here, not how did you do this. That's the big shift we're going to do next week at the beginning.
We'll never
Shift.
understand why he did it. We can only.
Well, we
follow the
can see
path
what
as to
they're-
the decisions that God made.
We see the end result,
Right.
so that we can reverse engineer and say what you did, not because you had to do those things. You could have done any way you wanted, but this is the fact of the way it is. So once we come from that premise, then what should preclude something from being godly? Nothing precludes from anything being him. It's just a question of what did you do? Oh, you made godly. Great. So you made godly. Now we're here. So it's only a question of reverse engineering from what we have rather than questioning how you did. And then once we have that, then we can truly start to understand what this means, that there are godly things, even though they don't define them. Okay, God willing, coming next week. A teaser as always. We try.
And you can
Have a good day.